Welcome to Mental Health Monday. My name is Mick Coyle. Coming up on the programme this week,
I had extreme anxiety. I couldn't leave the apartment, couldn't leave the bedroom. I ended up with quite severe depression. I hit rock bottom, like a lot of people do.
And obviously you focus on the breaking of that trauma cycle. But if we don't have the understanding, if we don't have the right methods, we can't break that cycle. And then the trauma is constantly living with you, presumably.
And you won't necessarily know that that's what's going on, because it's trauma is so sneaky. It gets into your personality and your identity to such a degree. It shapes your belief system that you think what you think and feel is normal. Actually, it's far from normal.
And I'll be reminding you how you can make connections with mental health organisations within your community. It's Mental Health Monday.
The home of the UK's conversation about mental health. It's Mental Health Monday, episode 248. Now, I'm just waiting to dot some I's and cross some T's for our special guest and a special event for episode 250. I can't say it just yet, but hopefully we've got something sorted, which should be a bit special, a little bit different, and hopefully with a live studio audience as well. If that doesn't play out, you'll just hear episode 250 go, and it'll just be normal, and I won't mention it. But fingers crossed we've got something lined up. And really looking forward to hopefully dotting the I's, I say, and crossing the T's to make it all come together in a couple of weeks' time. Bank holiday weekend this weekend, so if you're checking us out on the day the podcast is released, or even the day after, or even the week or month after, you're very welcome to the programme and to the conversation. We've got the author of a new book on the programme today. Wendy Kier is our guest. Now, the book is called Be More Wolf, a survivor's story breaking the trauma cycle. Now, you can find this in Amazon's a good place for it. It's been, as we'll hear, topping a number of their various different charts as well. And it talks through Wendy's life, the trauma that she experienced, but also how she's sort of learnt to deal with that trauma, sort of the skill set that she's picked up, and now how she helps other people deal with trauma. And trauma is one of those things which, in and of itself, the trauma isn't a mental health problem. But of course, mental health problems, the way we view ourselves, the way we view the world, can of course be hugely, hugely impacted by trauma. So it's very much in the spectrum of conversations that we have here on Mental Health Monday. It can have a huge impact on people's lives, from the most severe trauma to those things that might not impact some people, and yet for other people may be huge and may have a long and lasting legacy. Issues of, triggering, lack of understanding of a trauma that happened to them, and maybe a lack of education around what trauma is, the damage that it can do, and the issues, of course, that it can raise in our lives, maybe not straight away, maybe 10 years down the line, 20 years, 30 years down the line. And it can also take that long, as we'll hear on the programme today, to tackle some of those traumas and to deal with the impacts of those traumas in our lives. Wendy is our guest, a really great talker. We started off by talking about the book and actually the success that she's had since it was published.
Yes, I'm really pleased. It's in some great categories, well, what I would consider to be a great category, like violence against women, sexual abuse. So it's hovering around the top 10 in sexual abuse, and it regularly hits number 1. And the violence against women, I think it sits in the top 50. But Amazon's tricky. It has a different platform for every country. So depending on how many books you're selling in which country, it will depend on where you fluctuate in the Amazon charts.
I guess it's a sign, though, that it's hitting the right notes. And I guess when you start writing a book and you're thinking, will it connect? Will it reach the people who I hope it reaches? I guess this is maybe a sense that it is. It's finding those people that you really wanted it to reach.
Yeah, and it has such a specific audience. It's not a book that you would pick up and read at your leisure. It's a book that you would pick up and read if you've experienced something bad that's happened in your childhood, or if you're a professional, if you're a social worker, a doctor working on frontline. It's the type of book that is quite specific. It's not a book where you go, I'm going to read this over the weekend. People describe it as harrowing, which I'm not sure it's a good thing or a bad thing.
It's so interesting that I noticed someone on social media, I think I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago on the program, was talking about the phrase lived experience, and they were being a little bit sniffy about it, going, oh, when did experience become lived experience? And actually, this is a really good example of it. That if someone goes, do you have experience of trauma? It might be something that you remember, or that something that a friend of yours went through, or something you briefly touched upon. And you could say, yeah, I do have experience of it because of this. But actually, lived experience is, no, well, this was my life. This is, I am the survivor of this story. This wasn't just something that was happening. This was something that was defining my very existence for a period of time. And actually, when survivors tell their stories, I think they get a real sense of that phrase, lived experience. Absolutely makes sense. And that's the story you're telling in the book, first and foremost. Can we start by talking about your story? I think there'll be people who have trauma and have the same sorts of experiences in terms of the impacts on life, but everyone's story will be different, and the reasons for the trauma will be different as well. I understand yours were sort of born out from being placed in social care at a very young age.
Yeah, so I was removed from my dad at the age of 2. He was an alcoholic, and he used to leave me and my brother all over the place, go and get drunk, leave us, we'd get taken into care. Then eventually they took us into care full time. And during that time, I had over 30 foster placements. I had that level of foster placements, and then for some crazy reason, someone thought it'd be a really good idea for me to become adopted. So I was adopted when I was about 12 and a half. But, in the care system, still to this day, or when you're adopting a child, there's very little support for the carers to be able to manage someone who has been traumatized to that degree. So that only lasted a couple of years, and then I went back into the care system. So I'm absolutely a big believer that if trauma isn't addressed, if it isn't resolved, if it isn't healed, if it isn't reframed in the mind, that it will breed more trauma. A bit like stress, a bit like anxiety. Anxiety breeds more anxiety, stress breeds more stress, trauma breeds more trauma. So if you've had a lot of traumatic experiences in your childhood, you will find yourself in quite challenging and quite difficult situations when you become an adult, because you are still living your life through the trauma you experienced growing up. And you won't necessarily know that that's what's going on, because it's trauma is so sneaky. It gets into your personality and your identity to such a degree. It shapes your belief system that you think what you think and feel is normal. Actually, it's far from normal, and it's far from what other people experience who haven't been through trauma. This is the difference between a lived experience and somebody who's got the qualifications and the theoretical understanding. There's a big difference between someone who's got a lived experience and somebody who's got a theoretical knowledge. And one of my reasons for writing the book was that trauma is a very complicated subject. When I listen to people talking about trauma, I'm like, what the hell are they talking about? How do I apply that into my life today to actually make a difference? So I think that's the difference for me. Lived experiences, it's the rawness of it. You're in it, you're in the emotion of it. And the not having a lived experience is very theoretical, very knowledge-based. Let's apply this theory to what that person's experiencing. And it sort of removes the control from the person who's actually experiencing the trauma. Sorry, I know I'm darting all over the place. I'm sort of connecting the dots in my mind.
I think that absolutely makes sense. And I think actually, and we'll touch on within the book, Breaking the Trauma Cycle, this idea that this incident has impacts, and that impact then, of course, can then make the original incident seem worse and actually become a big part of someone's life. And obviously you focus on the breaking of that trauma cycle. But if we don't have the understanding, if we don't have the right methods, we can't break that cycle. And then the trauma is constantly living with you, presumably.
You're constantly triggered, is what happens. You become emotionally triggered. So something small can happen, and I was thinking a couple of years ago, I was in Bangkok, and I've always had a funky money story, which means I don't have a very good story when it comes to money. And I put my bank card in the machine and it didn't work. And I just went into full on panic, fear. And that was me being emotionally triggered by something that had happened in my past. And I could not snap out of it. So it took me a couple of days to realize what had happened emotionally, because I'd been triggered, and then work myself out of it as quickly as I could. But so that's just a small trigger. But what will happen for people who've experienced trauma is that they'll become emotionally hijacked. So it will last weeks, and it will last months, and it can last even longer, because they're in that loop and pattern of believing something to be true when it isn't necessarily true. And they think that's their personality and the way they are, but it's actually not. It's just a self-defense mechanism to help them cope. Help them cope with what's going. It's an illusion. It's just all an illusion.
And I think this is absolutely fascinating, because, of course, hopefully, people who hopefully are listening to this conversation, people you've spoken to, will be aware of sort of mental health and well-being and those sort of what it is, and the fact that when things happen to us, it impacts on our lives. But I wonder, Wendy, how many people are going and living their lives who have experienced a trauma, but don't have that as a label or something that they know about, so that if something like the bank incident happens to them, they just think, well, that's just how I respond. That's just how I am. Yeah. That's the sort of person that I am. Whereas actually there's, as you've described there, quite a clear reason and quite a clear psychological process is going on in our heads. But of course, if we don't know about those things, if we don't understand that we've experienced a trauma or whatever that thing might be, and that might be a grief point, or it might be, a triggering of a former incident of violence, whatever it might be. If we don't understand that, then we won't understand why other things are happening to us. And of course, that then has a damaging impact, doesn't it, on people's ways of thinking?
Absolutely. They should really teach this stuff at school. They should really teach how to manage thoughts, how we process thinking, how we manage our emotions, because they're much easier to, well, for me, I've learned that it's actually quite easy for me now to manage my emotions once I've understood what's going on. But, for a lot of people, this will be for a lot of people as well. I had extreme anxiety. I couldn't leave the apartment, couldn't leave the bedroom. I ended up with quite severe depression, and I hit rock bottom, like a lot of people do. And I discovered this guy called Joe Dispenza. He's an American guy, and he talks about you can reshape your personality, you can reshape your thoughts, but he does it from a scientific medical point of view. But I just absolutely fell in love with him, read his books, took on board what he was saying. And from that point, I woke up and realized that actually I had a choice to take my life in the same direction and keep having depression, keep having anxiety, or to actually slowly break that learned behavior, because that's all it is, learned behavior, and to create a new path and to head off in that direction. So it was that real bit of, actually, I am in control of what's going on. I can become a different person. I can choose to live my life a certain way. And the problem is, when people get triggered, they're on automatic pilot. They don't realize that they have a choice. They just think it's who they are and it's set in stone and that's it. But it's taken me 50 years to realize that. So I don't think I got it at the beginning.
I think that's fascinating, because actually what it tells you is, if you do get an opportunity to educate yourself, you can then learn and apply something which can then make a difference. Can I ask you about that? You've spoken before about incidents that happened to you when you were in the care sort of system, but at what point, when we talk about realizing that there is an issue that needs to be tackled, at what point in your life did you think, what has happened to me and my experience is wrong, and I'm not to blame for those things, and actually I deserve
A long
to have a
time.
better
Yeah.
life. At what point
Yeah,
did you
probably
suddenly go, oh, hang
about
on, a minute.
48.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I'd read loads of books, done loads of training, spent 20 years working with young people at risk in voluntary sexual and social services. So I'd done all the training, but there was a detachment between, so I completely re-traumatized myself. There was a detachment between reading about it, doing the theory, and actually applying it to myself as a person. So I was in such a high level of denial, and I would say things like that, oh, well, it wasn't that bad. It wasn't, I didn't have it that bad, which is just complete denial of my own experiences. So it would have been about 48, starting to realize that I could, and after having the depressive episode and the anxiety, that's when I realized that actually I needed to relearn everything. I needed to relearn everything that I thought about how I was seeing life. And that sounds really big, but it's actually not that big. It's the difference between between literally being closed off, not being able to talk to anybody. I was closed off, couldn't talk to anybody, to the complete opposite of that, and opening yourself up to be able to expand and receive it emotionally. So it's like either all or none.
Well, can I ask you about that? And I know you touch on it in the book, actually. And let's come on to it now, because I think it's a really interesting point. There will be some people, I imagine, who at the point of realization of something has happened to me, which I need to deal with, maybe a sense of fear that to deal with it, you need to fully explore it. But to fully explore it is to take you back to a place in which you are scared and traumatized or upset or vulnerable and all of those things. So how can you make sure that if you do step into understanding an incident in the past or series of incidents in the past, that they don't become then damaging, that you don't delve too deep in an unsafe way?
Yeah, I'm not a fan of delving deep. I'm a fan of, so I very much work on what's showing up now. So a lot of the women that I've worked with have an issue with being visible, of being seen. So there's something underneath that's stopping them from being visible and being seen and being heard. So we take a helicopter view and we go, okay, what was the incident before that happened? Can you remember a time when something happened where you felt you couldn't be visible? So we don't go into it, but we just go, okay, so that created that behavior. Can you think of a time before that? We go back, okay, what happened then? But not delving into the rawness and, getting a visual image, just very quickly having a look at, and then going back again and just connecting these dots so you can understand why you are behaving the way you're behaving. Once you understand why you behave the way you behave and why you think the way you think, you can then make a decision as to how you want things to move forward. But there is a piece in the middle which is really about, acknowledging the trauma and the pain and being able to release it. So there's a level of containment, but also at the same time, there's another piece wrapped within that, which is like, who actually do you want to be now in this present moment? Because all trauma does is it means that you're living in the past, you're not living in the now, and you're not living in the future. You're basically, your behavior is predictable from the past. So what we do is we, okay, why do you think you're behaving this way? Do you have a sense of that? Okay, let's acknowledge it, acknowledge the pain of it. Who is it that you want to be in this present moment going forward? And then we slowly step into that. That brings a lot of fear, but you have to manage that fear. So this is why it's helpful to know how to manage your thoughts and your emotions, and how to manage the fear that's playing out, and then slowly stepping into that. Once you start slowly stepping into it, you release the energetic hold that trauma has on you in that moment. So you're not paralyzed in the rawness of the emotions. you sort of slowly come out of it, and you're moving forward, and you're making different decisions based on what's in your best interest in the here and now, not in the crappy past.
Absolutely. You just used the phrase containment, and in my head I was trying to imagine like placing the incident and the trauma into a box, like, and then having that box still exists, and it lives in your sort of your mind's attic sort of thing. And I guess you've got to get it's got to be at a safe level. It can't be oozing out everywhere. You've got to have it contained, and so that it obviously doesn't cause problems down the line. Can I ask you what I don't know if this is something which is possible to explain, but what emotion what emotion do you attach to what's in the box now?
That's a really interesting one. I still am quite a detached person in terms of my emotions, and I have to really consciously sink into the rest of my body to feel it. Me and a client always used to have a joke, because I basically used to be cut off from the neck. I just used to live in my head. The rest of my body just didn't exist. So I feel actually quite detached from it. So there's no energetic connection to it, which is great for me. There's no energetic connection to it. I think it's a very important part of who I am, but it just doesn't consume who I am. Every now and again, that box will rattle, and then I have to bring it back down again. It doesn't mean it's resolved for life for me. It just means that I manage my trauma consciously all the time. It's a bit like an addict or an alcoholic, is that I manage it on an ongoing basis. It's not I've dealt with that, it's over. I think of trauma recovery as ongoing.
Do you ever sort of assess your sort of journey, if you like, your narrative? I think sometimes we sort of live our lives, don't we? And we think that, well, this is our life, so this is all that we know. But of course, if it was happening to somebody else or someone that you knew, you'd go, goodness me, 30 different foster care placements, of course that's going to have an impact on someone's sort of sense of sort of place and being and belonging, and all of that. That will be completely understandable. But sometimes if it's you kind of go, well, this is all that I know. Do you ever take a time to almost sort of look at your experience from, I'm sort of leaning across here to sort of explain that from a different point of view, and kind of go, well, if this was happening to somebody else now, of course I would recognize that maybe some of the things that were happening would have a long-term impact, a foreseeable long-term impact.
Yeah. Writing the book really helped. Writing the book is the best therapy I have ever had, because I could process at a much deeper level, and I could connect the dots even more. I could connect the dots to my behavior that I'd never seen before. But I've really got a level of detachment from my past. So it's quite safe in that box now, whereas before the box was everywhere. I was in it. It was like there was no box. There was no containment. There was no peace. I was always bouncing from one thing to the next. So I would see it in someone else, like I see it in other people now. But when I think of myself, it's an interesting question. I'm not sure I really see it unless I've really dropped into the emotion of it. Then I see it and feel it.
The book is called Be More Wolf, a survivor's story, and breaking the trauma cycle. We touched on the trauma cycle before. Let's talk about being more wolf. What are the aspects of being a wolf that you found to be sort of beneficial to drawing, if you like?
Yeah, so when I woke up and said to myself, God, everything I've learned, sorry, my cat is shaking the laptop, meaning looks like there's an earthquake.
That's fine. I thought you were going to say it was a wolf then, but
yeah. So when I realised that what I'd learned wasn't the best way to learn, I went on this quest to find what were the traits, what were the characteristics that I wanted to have. So there was the wolf, there was the divine divinely feminine, and there was the wild woman. But I really like the wolf because one of the wolf is great at is it has no attachment to the outcome. So I really like and have really lent into having no attachment to people, places, whether I get a client or not. And that has helped me significantly. So I had all of these different traits, characteristics of the wolf. And when I was struggling with something, I would just look at them and I would go, okay, I'm going to step into that. That's how I'm going to deal with this issue. I'm going to step into how the wolf would behave, some of those qualities. So that's how I use the wolf and those two other characters. So yeah, really powerful.
Does that level of detachment, does it still give you the option of becoming attached or finding a connection with the things that you want to be connected with, do you think?
I think I'm still experimenting. I think I'm still learning. I think I'm still experimenting. Trust was obviously always a very big issue for me. So I'm learning at this age to trust the people who are in my inner circle. So I think I'm very much still learning. I'm like a baby. You know, I really am like very conscious of what's going on in my head and the relationships that I have and how I'm thinking about those relationships. And that's why the divinely feminine is good, because she's all about love, compassion, see everything through love. It's very different. It's the opposite of how I used to think, which was fear. You're all evil. You want to kill me. Do other things to me. So I very much step into that all of the time. So it's like a baby relearning until it becomes normal.
It's interesting that it's not then just the wolf, but it's those other aspects that you can almost just pull in the part of the narrative which you feel is relevant to you. And I guess if you didn't have those things, you might think, right, well, where do I turn? I think sometimes people look for those things, don't they? Those sort of sense of, well, what's the what's the wider story, but it sometimes allows you to place things within a context, doesn't it? Or an order within your mind.
Like a parent. It's like really ultimately what those characters are parents, are guides, are sisters, are brothers. They are the true qualities of what I would like from somebody. And I had to have all three to balance, because you couldn't just be a wolf, because wolves are pretty ruthless. So I needed the divine feminine to balance the love and connection, to balance the wolf out, but have the wolf as that level of as a level of detachment, and then have the wild woman who's, I'm not even sure what the wild woman is anymore now. I lean mainly into the other two at the moment.
but the wild woman's there if you need to throw in the wild woman. No, I think that's really, really interesting that we have these sort of ideas in our head, because I think we all try and frame ourselves, don't we, within either what we hope to be, or maybe what we've seen before, might be parents or friends groups, or sort of what our societal expectation. And if they're helpful, then of course that can help us to grow. And then of course the other flip side is that sometimes people naturally grow up having those experiences, but they're from a negative point of view. It might be, a problematic people within their life, and they naturally move towards those behaviors because it's what they think they're supposed to do. Whereas actually, you talked about that very, I think, brilliantly, about making sure that those are positive things and allow you to be proactive and positive when you face those scenarios. Can I ask you as well, just almost to wrap this up as much as anything, Wendy, just about finding yourself when you've had incidents of trauma in the past, and there's a sense that there is this hangover, these incidents, and the box keeps overflowing and so forth. Do you get to the point now where you feel like I'm me now, I can be myself and I can define myself? I'm not going to say it's easy to get to that point. It must be incredibly difficult. But do you feel like you're there, that when you are with yourself in a moment, you can say, this is me, and I've earned this moment, if you like, and this is the very best of me, or is there such a hangover to some of those problems that there'll always be the shadow, if you like.
Yeah, I think I'm probably about 55% of the way there. So still very much, I'm probably being disingenuous, but I know how hard I have to work at it. And I know how easy it is to slip back into that old mindset. So I have to work at it. I'd say about 55% or 60%. And I will slip back. And I will slip back and something will happen and I won't realize I've been triggered. And then I'll start climbing out of that box, not consciously, unconsciously, and I'll come up and I'll go, oh, there I am. Like Peter Pan. Oh, there I am. It's like, so that's what was going on.
No, I think you've summarised that. What a great answer! You know, the 55% of the climbing out the box. No, absolutely, because I think it was as much as anything. Because we are as human beings, aren't we? We're essentially that we are existing in a world where lots of other things have happened to us. But I guess you can't take away the things that have happened, but we can choose, or we can find a way to either let those things either define us or not define us, or compartmentalise. Or to look elsewhere, and so on and so forth. So, but I think what you've absolutely said there is, and forgive me, I've got this wrong, but that it's a journey. It's a journey. Yeah,
it's really a journey, and it's a journey that life's hard. You know, if I hadn't even gone through this trauma, life is hard. Let's face it, it's not easy for anybody. But it is a journey, and it's whether you choose to deal with things consciously or not. It's your choice ultimately. And you touched on this earlier on, and this is such a big one, and it is literally about education and knowledge. The education and the knowledge is missing. If people had access to the education and knowledge, they would be more informed, they would be able to make better decisions and better choices for themselves. It's because they don't have access to that education that people aren't able to heal, and they get stuck into a system that just isn't going to serve them.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's that thing where you've got to be proactive on that, because you've got to be saying to people when they're young, if life is going to throw lots at you, and not all of it is going to be good, and when it's bad, these are the impacts it can have unless these steps are sort of taken. And that education is it's obviously out there, because people like yourself have been able to find it, and then obviously create your own resources, like the book now. But I think that fits into that much wider conversation, doesn't it, about how we prepare young people to face the world, and then what we then throw at these young people that they've then got to deal with.
They're difficult issues, aren't they? There's just such denial on so many different layers, society, the media, schools, the police, the whole system is built on denial. So it's really hard for people to break free and find their own way, because not only have they got to deal with the internal resistance of the fear of not wanting to look at it, but then they've got all of this other stuff around them that's telling them not to, and that they're bad, and it's not good. So
But I think as human beings as well, naturally, the easiest thing to do is accept the status quo and try and move with it. Like that's the easiest, and people do it in politics, don't you? See politicians doing you think you don't actually believe that, do you? But really what they're saying is, look, this just keeps me in a job for another 6 months if I just go along with it. If you look at the people who are siding with the violence in Ukraine and so on and so forth, on the various awful, but then sometimes you're hearing people go, oh, maybe he's got a point. You think, well, it's just easier to think that, because then you can accept in your own mind the scenario that you've seen, as opposed to thinking this isn't right, this isn't good, something needs to be done about this. But it's so easy, isn't it, just to say, what, let's just move with it. And actually, if we do that, what we do is we tell the next generation to say, just lump it, and if you can't lump it, that's your problem, as opposed to accepting that there are much wider problems in society, and society's got some major problems that we all need to deal with as a group.
Absolutely. I'm lost for words now. I'm lost for words, because it is incredibly complicated, and society has a way of coping which people get swept up in, which isn't necessarily the the right way to cope.
No,
I don't think I
exactly.
explained that very well.
No, I think there's so much in that conversation, isn't it, about coping, resilience, and that sometimes people say like if you're coping, but sometimes you've got to cope with life, haven't you? You've got to cope with, negative thoughts, or cope with difficult situations, cope with difficult people as well.
Life.
And there is, but then it comes to a point where, like, if that coping is chipping away at you, and you're thinking, well, are you coping? If actually, in the end, you're having a negative experience, as opposed to improving our resilience and improving the resilience of young people, so that when difficult stuff does happen, they have the protection element of the resilience, but then at the same time they also have a recognition that they shouldn't have to keep facing difficult things all the time, and there comes a point when those difficult things need to either be taken away from them, or they need to be removed from that environment as well. But I think it's a whole different way of thinking, isn't it, that we don't necessarily have, particularly in the UK with culture, that there is a sense of, well, if you don't like it, if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen. Phrases like that. They're the sorts of phrases.
Yeah, very English.
Yeah, the sort of go-to things that we talk.
Denial.
Yeah,
just denial.
Absolutely. Because it's easier to say, it's easier to say, oh, was the kitchen too hot for you? That's your problem, as opposed to someone going, actually, the kitchen's on fire and the house is going to burn down. It's easy. Like, we should be going there, but instead we go, oh, too hot for you. As it was like, yeah, it was literally 800 degrees in there. It's, we should probably do something about that. Oh no, it's your problem, because then it becomes they're the problem, and the house burning down isn't the problem. But that's
stiff up the English stiff upper lip.
I fit that.
Yeah, real denial. I think someone was saying that was created from the last war. I don't know how.
Well, I've said this many times. I've had this conversation on the program about keep calm and carry on, and all of those things that were born out of, even if things are really difficult, just carry on. And that was a poster to get us through literally being bombed every night, like that.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
Where it's actually, but then we moved on from that as a country, because we weren't getting bombed every night.
But we didn't.
We kept those same mindsets.
Yeah.
Of if stuff's happening, stiff upper lip, crack on, and everything will be fine. Whereas even Winston Churchill lived with depression, but we still have this thing of, oh yes, or Winston Churchill wouldn't have said that because he was this wartime leader. He was living with depression, had all sorts of issues as a result of that. But those are the mindsets I think that we grow up with, that obviously need to change.
It's crazy, and that collective trauma was never healed. It was taken as a norm. People had it as a norm. So it was never processed. It was never resolved. It was too painful for people to get to address it. So they just moved through it. It's just like layer upon layer of unresolved emotions that have never really been looked at.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's just toxic. It's just more toxic on top of more toxic. And now with everything else that's going on in the world, it's even more difficult to navigate.
No, absolutely. And I think if you think about those historic tales that have never been told, the 19-year-old who lived through the trenches of World War I, and then as a 40-year-old lives through the Blitz and the bombs, 20 years on, the trauma from 20 years previously going through. Those are stories that haven't been told, and we feel like we know all the stories from the war because we know about X, Y, or Z. But actually, if you think about what is that experience of somebody who at the age of 19 lost everyone they ever knew in the trenches, and 20 years later, maybe with a family they wanted to protect and a house and all of those things, living through, air raids or being even called up again to fight in another war, there must be unbelievable stories, probably that will never be told because the people aren't around anymore. But imagine that collective trauma that would have been at that time, that would have been absolutely huge. And of course, and the impact it has on the children of those people, and the experiences that they had as well. So I think it just goes to show that trauma is there, whether it's got a big capital T over the top of it, or whether or not it's those untold stories.
Well, I always think of trauma as just an event that changes your behavior, changes your behavior to such a degree that you do things consciously and unconsciously to avoid being in that situation again. So I always think of trauma like that, because you always get people judging, I'd said it earlier about, oh, it wasn't that bad. I didn't have it that bad. Playing it down. So it doesn't matter whether it's a small T or a big T. If it's an event that has affected you to such a degree that you change your behavior and you live your behavior by that based on something that's happened in the past, to me, that's trauma.
Absolutely. The book is out now. People can find it. If you type in Be More Wolf, Breaking the Trauma Cycle, or a survivor's story in there as well, you'll find it by Wendy Kier, Kier. That's Kier. Type that into the well-known websites where you can buy these sorts of books. I think we all know we're talking about the one called Amazon. But Be More Wolf by Wendy Kier. Thank you so much for your time, and it's really fascinating conversation. Good luck with the book. I know it's been a big success already, and I know it'll continue to be an important resource for many different people. So thanks for joining us on Mental Health Monday.
Thank you for your time.
I hope you've enjoyed this week's podcast. Thanks for checking out Mental Health Monday. My name is Mick Coyle. You can find me on Twitter at Mr. Mick Coyle. You can also find me, Mick Coyle, on Facebook as well. Don't forget, if you want to speak to somebody about your mental health, you can do so. The Samaritans, free to call on 116 123. You can find mental health services where you are. Just look for the Hub of Hope. Type in your postcode. It'll find those mental health services close to you. And for support in a crisis, you can text SHOUT to 85258. That's if you're experiencing a personal crisis, you're unable to cope and need support. Shout to 85258. That's a text line. Do get involved in those services. In an absolute emergency, always remember the number to call is 999. Thanks for downloading the podcast this week. We'll be back next week with more Mental Health Monday.